Everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about U.S. isolationism in the 1920s. Now, America chose isolationism following the end of the First World War, and isolationism is basically a plan to stay separate from other countries' issues. We did this because we witnessed the massive destruction and havoc wreaked upon Europe's political situations and economies, and we didn't really want to be a part of any of that. And because we also saw Europe as kind of prone to conflict and tension, we just decided, you know what, we're just going to back off and let them try to work out their problems on their own. Now, how did we go about isolationism, basically? So there were a few key things we did. First off, we avoided European alliances. This is a pretty obvious one. Political tensions ran high, economic situations were dire, and we simply wanted to avoid any sort of alliances which would cause conflict, more tension, and potentially even more armed conflict, another war. So we wanted to avoid anything like that. We also put tariffs on imported goods. And basically that means, so let's say you have a German car and an American car. If there are tariffs on imported goods, the German car will be more expensive, and theoretically, you'll buy the US car because it's cheaper. And this in turn helps stimulate the US economy as opposed to the German economy. So it's essentially a form of economic isolationism, and it sort of focuses on improving the economy from the inside out as opposed to any sort of trade. We also set harshly restrictive immigrant quotas, which is primarily due to the National Origins Act of 1929, which brought the US's So I guess like how many immigrants the U.S. accepted was only 150,000 in 1929 versus millions, a decade or two prior. And this was primarily due to the developing U.S. economy, which had been industrialized and shaped and formed by the First World War, and we just didn't really need masses of unskilled laborers anymore. There was also a sort of anti-European tension amongst the workforce as well. So we just basically wanted to keep American workers and avoid any sort of European workers from trying to come in. Now, despite all of this, was the US really isolationist? Not really. The US was still pretty involved economically and militarily. For example, working with Germans on their debt problem. Because obviously Germany had pretty harsh reparations imposed on them by the Treaty of Versailles, and the US opposed these harsh reparations to an extent. And so to sort of help out Germany in the 1920s, we worked with them to help them slash their debt problem. We also had a very big trade with Europe, because although we didn't want imported European goods, we were all for exporting goods to Europe, and our economy relied pretty heavily on that. We were also involved in Latin America and had naval conferences with other countries to ensure that everyone's individual interest in the Pacific was protected, and that we could all do our thing without any interference from other countries. We were even informally involved in the League of Nations, because although we weren't a member, we did do some things with them on the world stage. So, despite the US's political, hesitancy towards Europe, we were still pretty involved economically and militarily. And so the reality of the situation being, we weren't really isolationist.